Hello. This week's parsha is Kisovoi. We're getting quite near the end of the book of Dvarim, in fact near the end of the Torah. And the most well-known part of this parsha is chapter 28, the long Tochacha. But the beginning of the parsha is equally interesting, and there are actually some thematic links. It discusses the mitzvah of bikurim, of first fruits. What would happen is that in the land of Israel only, and the text is very clear about that, the farmer would identify the first ripening fruits of one of the 7 species, that's 5 species of fruits and 2 of grain, would mark them, collect them in baskets, and then in a great ceremony take them to the temple where the Kohen would wave them in a ritual before God, and most importantly, the farmer would make a declaration. This declaration is actually very familiar because it consists of 4 verses, and those 4 verses form the core of the Haggadah. The author, anthologizer of the text that became our Haggadah, chose them because they are the shortest exile to Exodus story that appears in the Torah, and then we elaborate. But here, the farmer just made the 4-verse declaration. The first verse says, "We went down to Egypt." The second is, "We were oppressed." The third is, "We cried out to God." And the fourth is that God redeemed us. But most importantly, it says, "V'ata, now you have brought us to this wonderful land, a land that's flowing with milk and honey." This was the destination. This was the purpose of choosing us as a people, taking us through the desert experience, out of Egypt and to the promised land. And now I acknowledge our glorious history, what you have done for me, my family, my nation, by giving you this gift of bikurim, of first fruits. Then the farmer prostrates, says a prayer, and then rejoices in the bounty that God has provided. The Mishnah devotes an entire tractate to bikurim, of which the 3rd chapter fleshes out a little what happened. Here's an excerpt. "How were the bikurim taken up to Jerusalem? All the inhabitants of the cities of the Ma'amad," that's the division of people who were designated to pray for those who were going to the temple, would assemble in the city, the Ma'amad, and they would spend the night in the open street, presumably to avoid ritual impurity, and they would not enter any of the houses. Early in the morning, an officer would say, "Let us arise and go up to Zion, into the house of the Lord our God." An ox would go in front of them, his horns bedecked with gold, and with an olive crown on its head. The flute would play before them until they would draw close to Jerusalem. When they drew close to Jerusalem, they would send messengers in advance, and they would adorn their bikurim. That means they would put flowers and attractive plants around the baskets. The governors and chiefs and treasurers of the temple would go out to greet them, and according to the rank of the entrance they would go forth. All the skilled artisans of Jerusalem would stand up before them and greet them, saying, "Our brothers, men of such and such a place, we welcome you in peace." The flute would play before them until they reached the Temple Mount. When they reached the Temple Mount, even King Agrippa's, meaning whoever you were, and Agrippa's is the example as a king of the Herodian period, would take the basket and place it on his shoulder and walk as far as the temple court. When he got to the temple court, the Levites would sing the song, "I will extol you, O Lord, for you have raised me up, and you have not let my enemies rejoice over me." A verse that may be familiar from Psalm 30. So a wonderful, beautiful ceremony. But ultimately, this is about a farmer identifying a fig and an olive, putting them in a basket and taking them to the temple. And yet, there's a significant amount of text devoted to this in the Torah, and a whole tractate of Mishnah, which explains a whole elaborate ceremony. All the workers of Jerusalem come out to greet people, decorations, flutes, gold-horned oxen, to celebrate the arrival of an olive and a date in a basket. To understand why so much devotion and why everyone comes and raises and excites and celebrates with them lies in a verse near the beginning. "V'lokachto meirishis kol pri ho'adomo." You shall take from the first of all the fruits of your ground. This word meirishis. Reshis means first of, the first fruits. That's where we get the word first fruits from. And in fact, a little later on, when the farmer makes a declaration, the same word reappears. There's a midrash which helps us to understand this. It's cited by Rashi. The word reshis, first, is reminiscent of the very first word in the Torah, bereshis, in the beginning, or in the beginning of, more correctly. In fact, the Torah should have begun the word borishono, which really means in the beginning. By saying Bereshis, it triggers a midrashic layer of meaning. Because of something called Rashis, God created the world. What might this Rashis be? Well, there are several examples. The Jewish people, the mitzvah of challah, taking a piece from the dough, but most importantly, Bikurim. Bikurim is about first. What this is saying is that the opportunity to recognise God's involvement in the world, particularly in a situation where the farmers put huge amounts of effort seeing off the crop, seeing off the bad climate, dealing with enemies, dealing with pests, and yet the fruit has begun to grow. At that moment, the farmer feels very proud of himself, herself, feels that we've really made it, look what I've achieved. At that moment, there's a challenge. Will the farmer be able to say, I attribute all this to God. I acknowledge that God has not just helped me here to make the crops grow. He's not just the first cause, to paraphrase the Rambam, Iloh Elois, the first cause of everything. Ultimately, there's a chain of causes that go back to the first cause, to God, but also has provided bounty and opportunity for my people going back to our ancient history, and hence the declaration. So all the fanfare, the standing up as they arrive, the declarations, the oxen, the flutes, the celebrations over what appears to be a trivial matter is not a trivial matter at all. Bikurim are about first, about recognising God in the world, about seeing God as the cause of everything. And ultimately, therefore, when the Midrash says, because of Rashis, God created the world, what it is saying is that the purpose of existence is to find an opportunity to bring the divine into this world, to use the world as a vehicle for spirituality, of which Bikurim, if you like, is the paradigm. And as such, it's something well worth celebrating and something worth thinking about as we begin to work towards our most famous Rashis, or Rishon, or Rosh Hashanah, which is just a couple of weeks away. Wishing you all a good Shabbos and sei gesund und stark.